On February 24th, 2022, early in the morning, Russian forces initiated a rapid full-scale assault on Ukraine's defences. The 37th Air Army, in coordination with Black Sea Fleet and the 448th Rocket Brigade of the Central Military District, initiated a cruise missile barrage against Ukrainian command and control installations with a focus on eliminating the integrated air defense system of the Ukrainian Air Force. These strikes were made in tandem with precision strikes on known Ukrainian S-300 batteries, long-range search radars, and Ukrainian Air Force fighter bases. At the same time, 4th, 6th, and 11th Air Armies of the Russian Federation began operations to sweep the airspace above the advancing Russian ground forces units, while striking Ukrainian frontline targets with a heavy focus on SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense. The Ukrainians, having been tracking the build-up of the Russian air forces, had scrambled the majority of their air force prior to the initiation of hostilities, and as such, the flankers of the 831st Tactical Aviation Brigade and the fulcrums of the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade moved to intercept Russian aircraft penetrating their airspace. Meanwhile, the Su-24s of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade and the Su-25s of the 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade launched with ordnance aboard in preparation to hit Russian columns advancing to contact around Kyiv and Kherson. As the sun rose over Ukraine, cruise missiles began impacting their targets, destroying a number of radar positions and several of the S-300 batteries guarding the capital. But due to the Ukrainian Air Force having launched the majority of their aircraft to meet the threat, mostly inoperable or older aircraft used for spares were lost to these initial strikes. More worryingly for the Russians, the accuracy of their strikes were far below their initial estimates, with one missile intended for the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense hitting an apartment block full of civilians, while others hit warehouses and shops instead of the storage areas and bases they were aiming at. It was at this point that the first air-to-air combat of the campaign began, as the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade, operating at extremely low altitude, flew a combat air patrol over Kyiv. Due to the Russian integrated air defense system in operation on the Belarusian and Russian border, S-400 SAMs and superior Russian fighters, high-altitude operations were impossible. Nevertheless, the MiG-29s attempted to engage, claiming probable kills on an Su-25 and an Su-30. However, 3 of the MiG-29s of the 40th Tactical Air Brigade were shot down by the Russian Offensive Combat Air Patrol. Their pilots didn't survive. As this occurred, the 11th and the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigades flew through the Chernobyl exclusion zone and across the Kyiv Reservoir to assault Hostomel Antonov Airport to threaten the Ukrainian capital. Initially, the Ukrainian air defense was unable to engage the assault forces or the Russian Combat Air Patrol with their Kubs and S-300s due to the sheer amount of electronic warfare presence from the Su-30s and Su-34s as part of the initial attack. However, once the assault got into close range, the Ukrainians managed to engage the threat with manpads and short-range IR SAMs. 3 transports, 1 Mi-35, and 2 Ka-52s were lost over the course of the battle for Hostomel, with the Russians taking the field within several hours. Almost immediately after these events, the Ukrainian capital's Quick Reaction Force counterattacked Hostomel with the support of the Su-24s from the 7th Tactical Air Brigade, retaking the airfield. Sadly, in the process of this fight, the AN-225 Mriya, the largest aircraft ever built, was destroyed during the battle. Meanwhile, in the south, the Su-25s of the 299th were sighted overflying the Dnieper River en route to strike the southern advance on Kherson, which they did successfully. Over these first few hours of the invasion, and across the next few days, there was limited but intense aerial combat across the northern and southern advances, with heavy losses on both sides. Attrition, as expected, was very bad among Su-25 and Su-24 crews from both sides, while the Russians lost 3 Su-34s and 2 Su-30s to Ukrainian SAMs, with another Su-30 destroyed by a Ukrainian Tochka cruise missile attack at Milarovo Air Base. Though Russian helicopter casualties were far, far worse, with no less than 20 being shot down by March 10th. However, while control of the air was viscerally contested, the number of successful ground strikes by the Ukrainians was starting to pose a significant challenge. TB2 Bayraktar UCAVs had been monitoring the rapid Russian advances on all fronts, but due to the time of year which Russia chose to invade, that being the tail end of winter leading into the spring thaw mud season, almost the entirety of Russia's invasion force was restricted to road-bound convoys. Furthermore, it was apparent that the Russians had not expected to meet the ferocious resistance they had encountered, and as a result, their light advance forces had rushed forward behind Ukrainian lines, only for their heavier forces and their logistics train to be hit hard by resistance fighters and anti-tank guided missile hunter-killer teams. This left the majority of the Russian advanced forces outside of their integrated air defense network and clustered in traffic jams along the roads. The Bayraktars and the surviving tactical aviation units of the Ukrainian Air Force began pounding these advanced convoys with relative safety, as they were now inside their own airspace and operating at low level for the most part, inflicting atrocious damage. By contrast, the Ukrainian integrated air defense system had remained intact throughout the initial phase of the conflict, despite the heavy losses to their S-300 systems from cruise missiles. Russian air casualties began to mount drastically, especially their reconnaissance UAVs and helicopters, while the Su-25 squadrons were also hit very hard. At the same time, by this point, Ukrainian tactical aviation had begun to show some aggressive initiative in striking targets inside Russia. Mi-24 and Mi-8 helicopters, configured with anti-tank guided missiles and rocket pods, struck the main fuel storage depot in the city of Belgorod, providing the majority of the fuel supply for their advance on Kharkiv, while Su-24s from the 7th continued attacking Russian logistics centers and headquarters behind the lines near Kyiv and Kherson. They achieved quite significant success, but only at great cost to themselves. By the date of writing and recording, almost the entirety of Ukraine's Su-24 fleet has been destroyed in action or destroyed on the ground after being rendered inoperable due to lack of spares or just casualties, with many of the brave men of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade having given their lives for their country. Throughout March and April, the Ukrainian and Russian fighter squadrons did sporadic battle over the Kyiv front, with both sides achieving kills. But the decisive advantage in missile technology to the Russians made approaching and killing Russian aircraft very difficult for the flankers and fulcrums defending the capital. The Ukrainian Air Force's primary missiles for their fighter force are the R-73 Archer heat-seeking missile and the R-27R first-generation Alamo semi-active guided missile. The Archer is a very capable heat-seeking missile attached to a helmet-mounted sight. It was, and still is, one of the most capable short-range missile systems in the world, used by everyone who operates the flanker and fulcrum platforms. The R-27R, by contrast, is a semi-active missile, and a rather outmoded one at that. Semi-active missiles, such as the R-27R or the AIM-7 Sparrow, require the aircraft which fires the missile to maintain lock on the target all the way to impact. The Russians, meanwhile, have access to the R-77 and the R-77-1 active radar-guided missiles. These missiles are able to be fired at longer ranges, and after a certain distance, they activate their own inbuilt radar seeker inside the missile, which then tracks targets it detects in front of it, independent of the radar system of the fighter that fired it. What this means is that the Russian fighters operating inside their air defense screen at higher altitudes are able to fire missiles down on the Ukrainians, which forces them to dodge out the way, and this then lets the Russians press their attack without having to worry about keeping their radar on the target. They can maneuver freely and fire a second shot, while the Ukrainians are just trying to turn around and get their weapons on target. The result was a no-man's land, where the Russians couldn't fly ground attack sorties due to the resistance from SAMs and fighters, while the Ukrainians were unable to confront and successfully repel Russian fighter sweeps, leaving the issue to be decided by the men on the ground. And as we saw, with the Russians withdrawing from Kyiv, Kharkiv and Sumy, leaving the atrocities at Bucha and general devastation in their wake, the NATO training and equipment, combined with the Ukrainians' force of will and tenacity, proved to be decisive. But the air war was, and still is, far from over. Since mid-March to now, confirmed losses on both sides are sitting at 10 to 15 manned aircraft. 6 Bayraktars have been confirmed destroyed, while the Russians have lost several of their 4+ drones, a license-built version of an Israeli design, and well over 50 of their lighter UAVs. However, these are just the visually confirmed casualties, and losses on both sides are most likely slightly higher than this. That said, I should advise the viewer that the official claims you see from both the Russians and Ukraine are, to put it politely, bovine excrement. Grade A fertilizer, a pile of steaming refuse, as it were. If Russian kill claims are correct, they have destroyed the entire Ukrainian Air Force twice. while if the Ukrainian claims are to be believed, Russian frontal aviation would need to raid the Moscow Military District Air Park Museum for new jets. I'll post Kyiv independence figures here for the sake of comparison with Oryx's confirmed aircraft shot down per nation, to give you an example. Now, if I may speculate, due to the fog of war, neither side admitting losses and the chaotic nature of air combat, meaning that not all destroyed aircraft will be accounted for, I am willing to bet that Russian casualties are between 50 to 70 aircraft, while Ukraine's losses are most likely accounted for. I would say maybe a couple are missing, purely because we don't know where every aircraft crashes. And of course, simply put, they would almost all have crashed in Ukrainian territory, and the deaths of pilots are always published in Ukrainian news outlets. That and Ukraine's air force is small, yet they are still flying sorties, so their casualty rate can't be anywhere near as high as Russia is reporting. This whole situation, though, shouldn't be surprising, as overclaiming kills is not new in aerial warfare. In fact, it has been endemic to almost every single statistical report filed by an Air Force intelligence officer from any country. During World War I and World War II, overclaiming of over 50% was not uncommon among the RAF and Imperial Japanese air services. And in the Soviet Union's case, during the earlier stages of the war when things were really dire, overclaiming of over 100% was often done for propaganda purposes. Even the Luftwaffe, who were notoriously strict on confirming kills, overestimated Allied bomber losses over Germany by a factor of 2. Overclaiming is simply a product of the chaos of war, and in modern times it would be especially prevalent with the advent of PVR technology. If a Russian or Ukrainian pilot fires a missile, and the target he shot at disappears from radar, he'll put down a kill, where in reality the enemy pilot broke radar contact by diving to the ground and notching the incoming missile. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, notching a missile is when a pilot flies parallel with the missile's course while diving to the ground, putting the missile at an angle where its radar can't maintain the lock on the target due to its sensors being confused and unable to discern the target from the ground clutter and relative speed of closure. Should this occur and no contact is re-established either by the attacking aircraft or by their AWACS support, the pilot who fired may believe they destroyed the target and report it as such. At least that's my theory as to why claims are so high. Given the nature of BVR combat, you are beyond visual range, so you're unable to visually identify the kills unless the aircraft crashes in your territory. And both sides have got a vested interest in not reporting or showing those losses. Either that or it's just pure propaganda from both sides, which, given the regimes we are dealing with here, is perfectly likely. As March gave way to April all the way through to now, air operations have shifted to the Donbass region to support the new Russian offensive there, and the dynamic of the operations has changed. Sortie numbers from both sides have increased, while actual air combat is rather low. After the initial phase of the war demonstrated that neither side had the capability to secure the airspace to safely operate, the Russian Air Force's focus shifted from SEAD and CAS to operational missions far closer to traditional aerial warfare, namely the destruction of identified fixed targets via tactical and strategic aviation, and the maintenance of air superiority over the battlefront with air superiority fighters and interceptors, all the while moving their IADs closer to the cover of the front line. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, have reorganized their IADs from a traditional defensive network to a zonal area defense force, each operating independently to control a particular piece of sky, while using their remaining fixed-wing and rotary aircraft to strike targets where possible, while the fighters fly interception missions or limited combat air patrol inside their air defense zone to repel any intruders, as well as to provide a much-needed morale boost for the populace. Knowing that the home team is watching the skies is a powerful psychological factor, especially given these circumstances, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Though, as you get closer to the front lines, things are a lot sketchier. Each side still has a number of mobile SAMs and a high proliferation of manpads, making conventional operations impossible. We have seen footage of helicopters conducting rocket strikes much like Grad or Katyusha systems, by climbing into an arc and releasing their ordnance before returning to treetop height. This maneuver was actually designed to maximize the range of the rockets while enhancing survivability prior to this war. It's actually in the Soviet Field Handbook. It's in their operational manuals, as experiences in Afghanistan had demonstrated the threat of manpads. So it's not really an act of desperation, rather a doctrinal procedure for dealing with a high-threat environment, as operating close to the front lines while employing their weapons as intended will result in almost immediate death for either side. However, it does make for a rather expensive operational consideration, given that these helicopters aren't cheap to run, and they are still at risk of being shot down by roving hunter-killer teams or guerrillas. Also, all those expensive Kokon and attacker missiles are now going to sit in their depot, wasting away in storage crates because you can't fly close enough to use them. One might as well just use artillery instead. In fact, that makes this a great time for a drone segue! UCAVs employed at the beginning of the conflict, such as the Bayraktar and the Russian Forpost, have since been used exclusively as long-range reconnaissance or rear area patrols. The lethality of these systems seen early on was only due to the fact that Russian forces had pushed too far, and were too bunched up on the roads, unable to deploy their air defense. Now that the front line is stabilized, and the Russians are being more cautious, the UAVs have returned to their primary role: battle space awareness and recon. The lethality of modern air defense systems is so insane that both sides have to get creative with how they employ their assets. For example, during the destruction of the Russian cruiser Moskva, it was a TB2 that distracted the air defenders aboard the ship, while Ukrainian shore batteries engaged, with the aid of a US Navy P-8 Poseidon. While the Russians have been using some of their cheaper UAVs to probe Ukrainian airspace to try and force the Ukrainian SAMs to light off their radars, allowing for a hovering Su-34 with a Kh-31 Krypton anti-radiation missile to smack it in the face. Essentially, they're using their cheap drones like a controlled version of the US glide decoy the Tald. Ukrainian pilots operating at the front have cited the Kh-31 as the biggest problem for their air defense right now, as it's a capability they just don't have, meaning they have no ability to launch seed operations of their own. If the Russians want to deploy enough air power to a particular location on the front line, they can essentially achieve near-air superiority in the local area as long as they are operating safely above man pads at infrared SAM altitude. They just have to make sure they don't stray outside of their own SAM cover into the Ukrainian integrated air defense system. Though, as you've probably guessed, the biggest evolution in aerial warfare that has come out of the modern era is the increase of what I would call battlefield UAVs, such as the Orlan 10, or those Amazon drones the Ukrainians have been modifying to drop mortars. The advent of advanced commercially available drones with modern high-resolution 4K digital cameras has revolutionized the modern battlefield. Think about the implications of these systems for a second. I'm sure most people watching this video have played a game of chess, and I bet there's a bunch of gamers amongst you watching this video, like League of Legends, Battlefield. We definitely have some Call of Duty players watching. Could you imagine having real-time information about what your opponent is planning? What if you could see how the enemy team is moving, where their strong points are, what their game plan is? I mean, you see it in your games all the time when you've got the UAV ability most of the time. Often when you discuss wars, and granted I did it too at the start of this video, we measure weapons capability. We measure what they're able to do. We measure, the size of guns, the amount of ammo they have, etc. But do you notice how I keep harping on about situational awareness and data link systems in aircraft, and emphasizing the integrated part of the integrated air defense system? Information is key. Coordination is key. Know thy enemy while knowing thyself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Sun Tzu said it years and years, centuries ago. It may be an older adage with a different meaning inherently, but its core message is the same. If you have good intel, good communications, and complete battle space awareness, that is what will carry the day in this modern age. And both sides realize this, and they have been having excellent success. Due to the small size and subsequent low radar cross-section, the commercial drones, NATO's battlefield UAVs, and the Orlan series of UAVs have been able to operate over the front line with far less risk than larger UCAVs or fast movers, as they are able to evade detection altogether, or if they are spotted, they aren't worth spending a missile on that costs more than the drone itself. This real-time intelligence asset has proven most deadly as an artillery observation aircraft and a forward air control platform, rather than as a weapon itself. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have been conducting deed strikes using drones by finding SAM sites with them, and then smacking them with long-range artillery. Likewise, UAVs have been used to locate artillery systems to spot for counter-battery fire. I highly recommend my friend Perrin's video regarding artillery, as the gunners have become the most vital combatants on both sides of this war. But it's modern aviation that's giving these weapons their teeth. In fact, we have caught the entirety of a successful artillery deed operation on camera from a Bayraktar. Snake Island, the site of the famous Russian warship Idianahui incident, had been reinforced and fortified with Tor-SAM systems and a garrison of Russian Marines in order to guard the western flank of the Black Sea Fleet. Not that it helped them much. Sorry, the Russians losing their Black Sea flagship literally named Moscow to a country without a navy is still funny. But the Ukrainians managed to get artillery in range of the island. Then they used the drone to correct the artillery, walking rounds right onto the SAMs, shutting down the island's air defense, which then led to the local flanker drivers demonstrating just how effective NATO flight training combined with Ukrainian balls is. For the record, this is some of the coolest combat footage I've ever seen from any war, ever. But the drones aren't limited to recon. Oh no. The Ukrainians, ever the ingenious ones, have been bodging together mortar drones, which, while of dubious accuracy, are good enough to be a pain in the ass for Russian infantry and gun and vehicle crews. And it definitely beats a traditional mortar or going to fight them the old-fashioned way. While the United States has been sending them Switchblade loiter munitions. These wonderful little weapon systems are launched from a drone catapult over the battlefield and fly in orbit while the operator scans for a target. Once a target is located, the drone offers its prayers to the God Emperor and then dives straight into it, hence its nickname, a kamikaze drone. I don't doubt since this revelation that the Russians are improvising or developing their own, but I haven't found any evidence of their use yet. Post-production Pac-Man here. I did actually find that the Russians are in fact using loitering munitions and have done since March of this year. However, the results of their use have been mixed. No doubt due to their excellent build quality. I do in fact have a quote from the brochure here for the product. If you give me a moment, let me bring it up on my screen here as I'm recording this in post-production, as you know. Yes, here it is. Okay. Zala Aero. So the Zala Aero Kub UAV is what it is. It's a loitering munition. A high precision, quote, high precision kamikaze drone. High precision. Roll tape.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Staggering accuracy. But now we've covered the state of play, the course of the war, how the lethality of the battle space has rendered helicopters and UCAVs to supporting roles, and we've discussed the expansive development of the UAVs in this conflict and their employment. We've covered all of these complex subjects, and it now returns us to the original thesis of these whole videos, and the question that everyone has been asking. How does the Ukrainian air defense still exist, and why has it been effective? And the bigger question, why have the Russians seemingly performed so dismally? Well, let's answer the first one. When the Pentagon briefing regarding the air war was initially released back in March, the word used to describe the Ukrainian air defense strategy was creative. And not wanting to sound like a cop-out, that is very much the active word. While due to operational security, we don't have precise details on what they are doing exactly or where they are doing it, primary sources have been able to shed some light on it. As mentioned before, in the wake of the early days of the campaign, there was a major rethink on how to structure the IADs based on Russian seed operations. Covering their initial advance, there was a very heavy electronic warfare presence on the first day, in coordination with their cruise missile strikes and the air assault on Hostomel. This ended up costing the Ukrainians several of the S-300 batteries, along with a number of their heavier search radars. But the mass deployment of seed and air power that Western observers, including me, expected, didn't materialize. There was no mass wave of Russian aircraft constantly bombarding Ukraine. They just didn't show up. This gave the defenders some breathing room. The Ukrainians decided that a loose structure of organization was the way to go in order to ensure their effectiveness and, more importantly, their survivability. While it has not been confirmed for obvious geopolitical reasons, we have confirmed via OSINT sources that NATO AWACS have been skirting the edge of Ukrainian territory in a racetrack pattern since the start of the war, kept on station 24/7, escorted by F-35s and Eurofighters. In a more polite version of the common phrase used by today's youth, NATO has adopted the attitude, "Fornicate around and thou shall be illuminated presently." So it is safe to assume that Ukraine has AWACS support covering the western half of the country, and that AWACS support can't be destroyed without starting World War III. And all that time, Ukraine was being supplied with replacement S-300 systems and their vital search radars to cover the eastern half of the country from safety behind the Dnieper River. With this done, the core infrastructure of their IADs was secure, and so they could turn their attention to controlling airspace near the battlefront. To achieve this goal, they've reorganized frontline air defense units and their mobile SAM batteries into zones of control, essentially forming their own mini IADs to cover a region of territory. These are all linked back to the military district headquarters for their region, who then track Russian air activity. And what they've started doing is essentially fighting an aerial guerrilla war, or a kind of integrated air defense fleet in being strategy. A strategy of denial. They deny airspace. This is a very hard task to achieve and requires great coordination. But with the NATO support and the new heavy SAMs, they've made it work. Here's how. Search radars give off a lot of energy. So much, in fact, that should you activate one, you are essentially shining a torch into a dark room screaming, "Hey, look at me, I've got a torch, isn't this cool? Check it out, look at me, over here." Given that the Russians have electronic warfare aircraft, they can now see you, and as the saying goes, if you can see it, you can hit it, and if you can hit it, you can kill it. So, if a SAM battery turns on a high-frequency search radar in tandem with its attack radar, the enemy will be able to suppress the SAM by engaging it, forcing them to turn off their radars and relocate to a new position, buying time for their tactical air to hit targets with impunity. However, what the Ukrainians have done is use their long-range search assets as real-time intelligence, which they then feed to these short and medium-range air defense cells, kinda like guerrilla cells. These units keep their radars off and stay mobile, hiding in wooded areas in between buildings and under other cover. Once intel comes in that the Russians are mounting an incursion, these units move to a high readiness and lay in wait. Once the bandit moves into a high probability kill range, they quickly deploy, engage their attack radars, and fire, either hitting the target or at least forcing them to run away. This done, they then pack up and relocate to another prepared position. This whole process takes under 10 minutes, and by the time the Russians can get through their Byzantine command and control system, they are unable to allocate fires for a deed mission. This method has proven very successful, especially against Russian close air support flights flown by Su-25s, who have been steadily losing aircraft on the order of 1 or 2 a week, which, given that Russia's modernized fleet of SM-2s and SM-3s is around 100 airframes, that loss rate isn't great. This guerrilla war style has been tied in with a very aggressive proliferation of manpads and infrared SAMs, who are dug in around artillery fire bases, entrenched positions, and camouflaged on likely ingress and egress routes for attacking aircraft. As stated before, both sides have thrown so much short-range air defense into the front lines that attacking anything in the FIBA, forward edge of the battle area, below 10,000 feet AGL, is almost suicidal. This, as you can imagine, has made life for the helicopter pilots very unpleasant. And while this is to be expected, frontline rotary activity has basically been reduced to the aforementioned indirect rocket bombardment, but they still do conduct rear area patrols, logistics, and troop deployment, and the occasional recon mission. Actually utilizing them offensively, as seen in the early phase of the conflict, has basically ceased to occur. Though the Ukrainian helicopter pilots can occasionally be seen doing deep penetration strikes, flying on the deck in between trees to hit strategic targets. But also often these come at a cost, and more often than not it's one way. And even the measures in place from both sides, like modifying their tactics and flying conservatively, helicopter losses are still atrocious, as they have been in every war they've fought. But this hyper-lethal low-altitude airspace has had an alternate effect. Due to the possibility of ambush from pop-up SAM attacks and the man-pads threat, CAS aircraft have been forced to operate much higher than their optimum weapons employment altitude. Unguided munitions and gun runs are not really effective on battlefield targets unless you can get right down and visually identify the target. And given that we are fighting in the grey overcast skies of Ukraine against two armies equipped with the same gear, this becomes essentially impossible to do without getting down in the weeds, to use an aviator term, which brings you right back to the hyperlethal airspace. But this actually gives the Ukrainian CAS pilots a slight advantage, given that they are the defenders and they have an air defense sector controller. They know where friendlies are and, more importantly, where they aren't. And one advantage that is generally overlooked, while they are not that prevalent and they aren't as well equipped as their NATO colleagues, the Ukrainians do have a small number of NATO-trained JTACs with experience in conducting CAS operations in the Donbass over the past half a decade. And while they too are suffering losses like their Russian counterparts, they are having more success per sortie as a result. But that leads me into the actual air component of the Ukrainian air defense and how they've been doing. The adaptability of the Ukrainian Air Force has been their greatest strength, but it's their ability to wring every inch of utility out of the aircraft they have that is truly making the difference. The Soviet designs have a lot of flaws and are rather primitive compared to Western aircraft of comparable design, but there is one upside they do have. They have rough field capability. They're easy to fix as long as you have the parts, and occasionally even if you don't. Plus, the 29s and the flankers have a really short takeoff roll due to their really high power to weight and wing loading, allowing them to operate from shorter runways, or rather, freeways. The Ukrainians are dispersed throughout the western half of the country, both on old airfields recently reactivated and in hard shelters alongside major roadways with forests nearby. Where they are precisely, nobody knows, and I'm glad about that. But we have seen photos of Ukrainian MiG-29s refueling on a highway, and NATO exercises prior to the war have shown Scandinavian and Eastern European members practicing short field landings on clear stretches of road. So that would be my best guess. But by dispersing to alternate fields and hidden runways, they've been able to stay in business and fly sorties all throughout the war despite the overwhelming numbers they are up against. And that has resulted in very creative tactics. The Ukrainian aviators have taken the question, how low can you go, and decided that they were going to win that competition for all time. We have footage of MiGs flying frontline combat air patrol at under 100 feet, and their helicopters are almost meeting their shadows. It's insane. They've been popping up and engaging targets before breaking contact. Air-to-air kills in this method aren't really possible unless you're really close, but one trick we've seen the Ukrainians employ is to spike a Russian fighter with their radar, fire a missile, and then run away west in afterburner. The Russians, naturally, chase after them, only to find out rather quickly that they have been dragged over one of the Ukrainian pop-up SAM ambushes. They have gotten a couple of Russians this way before the enemy wised up. I haven't been able to get other confirmed strategies or tactics in use. As one can imagine, the Ukrainians aren't exactly keen on sharing them. But the overall gist is this. The Ukrainians are rewriting the book. In an odd way, they're kind of taking the air campaign that was waged by the North Vietnamese to its ultimate conclusion. They've refined it into its final form. Guerrilla air war in the digital computer age. And they have managed to stay in the fight long after they should have been out for the count. As one retired US fighter pilot said, after this, among NATO and allied aviators, the Ukrainians are now the experts. We will be learning from them for the foreseeable future. Thankfully, in the present day, conditions over friendly territory have improved, with MiGs and flankers of the Ukrainian Air Force flying combat air patrol at regular altitudes, while the Frogfoot pilots have been doing some death-defying nonsense down low. Losses are still occurring, as this is the nature of war. Both sides are trying to win, obviously. But they have been able to source pilot replacements, and with NATO support, they've gotten some new planes. However, despite what is, quite frankly, a heroic effort, there is a cold, stark reality, and that is logistics. And that fact, logistics, is the biggest threat to the Ukrainian air defense. Former Warsaw Pact weapons are, by their very nature, almost certainly over a decade old, if not longer. The surplus supplies Poland, Czechia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltics are providing are not unlimited. Once these supplies are depleted, the only manufacturers that can reliably provide a resupply in the quantity they require are Russia and China, which, as you can imagine, are not exactly in the mood to give them weapons. Or in the Russian case, at least not voluntarily. The simple fact is, Ukraine's Air Force will have to fully convert to NATO gear, not simply because they are superior systems, but because their Soviet legacy SAMs and aircraft will not be able to function should the war go on for a lengthy extended period. Thankfully, though, I have anonymous sources on the street saying that Ukrainian personnel have been spotted at air defender training courses for Patriot missile systems in the United States, and Congress has approved the training and equipping of Ukrainian aviators with modern 4th-generation US aircraft. If we can get them Patriots and F-16 Vipers in enough quantity with enough logistical backup, we will see this game change, with the first priority being armed with the AGM-88 HARM. Post-production Pac-Man here with some exciting news. It's been confirmed via photographic evidence of missile fragments, and from the United States, the Pentagon themselves have confirmed that the Ukrainians are in possession and operating the AGM-88 HARM. Either they've managed to jerry-rig it to the Su-27 and the MiG-29, or we already have Ukrainian F-16s in the mix. Hell fucking yes, boys! That's what we're talking about. It would seem that the Russian SAM operators, given that they've lost a couple of their S-300 and 400 systems already to the HARM, are in fact in harm's way. We need to give them the ability to start chipping away at the Russian integrated air defense system in order to pave the way to start seriously putting warheads on foreheads. And if some Air National Guardsmen, some patriotic Americans who happen to speak a little bit of Ukrainian, were to get a voluntary 6-month sightseeing vacation to Poland with wide-ranging bus tours, if you know what I mean, that would also be a good move. All I'm saying is that during the Spanish Civil War, we had entire squadrons of volunteer aviators from around the world on both sides, and the F-16 is the most prolific NATO aircraft currently in service. There is no end to the number of fighter pilots that you can draw from, and knowing fighter pilots like I do, they will not have a shortage of volunteers to get the title MiG Killer. Trust me on that. If they need volunteers, there are tons of pilots who will be more than happy to climb in the seat for Ukraine. You can count on that. But we still haven't addressed the elephant in the room. No, not him. That's Steve. He's meant to be here. Russia had superior technology, superior aircraft, greater numbers, and the strategic initiative. They had everything in their favor. So how have they failed to completely sweep the skies of the enemy and exert dominance over the battlefield, blasting Ukrainian ground forces while paving the way for a glorious armored thrust to Kyiv? Well, I think the first place to start is the whole discussion around superior technology. After all, the Russians did have superior technology to the Ukrainians, and still do at this present time. However, remember the old Einstein saying, it's all relative. They have relative superiority, and the subsequent limitations of it, as the situation demonstrates. Their aircraft are most definitely superior to the equipment Ukraine has, for now. But that is, of course, relative to their own aircraft built in the 1980s. As has become apparent, despite what the internet trolls screaming, "This weapon terrifies America, here's why," will tell you. Seriously, those videos blow my mind. First, that anyone clicks on them, and second, the thumbnails are outrageous. Also, another question, why does no one actually talk in those videos? Like, 90% of military analysis videos are just text-to-speech bots. Are y'all just not, like, intellectually bankrupt, but literally as well? Like, dude. Sorry. That was a tangent. But yeah, look. The lack of higher quality technology in the Russian Air Force has proven to be a huge challenge for their pilots, specifically battlespace information gathering, battlespace coordination, electronic warfare, suppression of enemy air defense, and deficiencies both in the number of precision weapons they have and the advanced methods for those weapons' employment. Yeah, there's just only a few issues facing the Russians. Throughout the entirety of its existence, Soviet and later Russian aviation has struggled with integrating advanced technology into its aircraft, mainly due to the lack of a serious player in the indigenous high-tech computer industry. As mentioned before when discussing the development of Soviet SAMs, one reason why there was such a focus on developing higher quality ground-based systems is simply because you don't have to be concerned about weights and size when building ground installations. The poorer quality electronics and bulkier computers of Soviet design were hindrances to developing the various avionics packages and radars for their fourth-generation fighters. So while the aircraft itself is truly exceptional in design and raw performance, the Russians can build a very effective aeroplane. The actual weapons and information and warfare systems that make it a combat aeroplane are not up to the standard required for the missions of today. Much of the technology we have seen introduced into the modern flankers and the Su-34 has been developed by reverse engineering or retrofitting technology purchased commercially from the West, Japan, and Korea, and as you can imagine, that gear is one or two steps behind their own for obvious reasons. As a result, their data link capability and force integration are not anywhere near NATO's capability. This is extremely detrimental on the modern battlefield for a number of reasons. In air combat, it makes life hard, as you have a limited awareness on who or what's around you, making you vulnerable to pop-up threats or enemy fighters that have evaded your AWACS controller. But the primary issue in this case is that real-time targeting information is the first prerequisite of successfully conducting a strike. You need to have accurate data on what the target is, where it is, and where your own guys are. This conflict especially relies on that last part, as everyone is driving the same thing and is mostly dressed the same. It's why everyone is wearing armbands like an airsoft match. You need to be 100% sure before you engage a battlefield target, and even then, aside from the very few men integrated into Spetsnaz and select VDV teams, the Russians do not have JTACs like we do to coordinate these strikes or mark the targets for the fast movers. So when all these aircraft fly into an area of operations, the only one managing them is the AWACS controller, who doesn't have any idea what's going on in the battle space beyond Ukrainian air activity. And when they arrive on station, there is no one able to call for and then precisely guide them to the targets in the field, which then leads into the problem that has proven even more detrimental: the lower quality and overall shortages of RTGPs, reconnaissance and targeting pods. In modern close air support, the ability to identify targets quickly and clearly, along with the ability to program GPS munitions or solo laze the target, is absolutely vital. When tied in with data link and a JTAC on the ground, this ensures you can hit exactly what you are trying to hit. The Russians have a critical shortage of targeting pods and advanced digital targeting systems in their aircraft. Their Su-25s don't have any advanced targeting systems, nor the ability to mount targeting pods should they be available. The Su-24s and the Su-30s have systems in place to support digital targeting, but there are only a few pods to go around, and those are older systems of lower quality, unable to provide the weapons guidance or reconnaissance options required on the modern battlefield. The only aircraft really capable of performing these strikes required are the Su-34 fullbacks, which have an integrated system inbuilt inside the aircraft. But once again, these systems are natively built Russian designs dating back to the early 2000s, which are roughly equivalent to the American Lantern pod dating back to the 90s. It suffers heavily from atmospheric interference such as clouds and precipitation, and given that they are operating in Eastern Europe's largest farming region, which as you can imagine gets quite a lot of overcast and rain all throughout the year, and in the summer it's in between the Black Sea and a humid swamp, this poses a really significant challenge. And that's saying nothing about the image quality, which is potato. I mean, look at this. Come on. How are those guys supposed to precisely target anything with this is beyond me. I don't know how they do it. The only real success they've managed is by having terminal laser guidance provided by ground teams who can actually see the target and laze it, which, as we've established, is pitifully few. They don't have enough SOFLAM systems, they don't have enough JTACs, they don't have anything like the capability to direct their frontal aviation fires. And that also means you'd be flying over the front line in range of the enemy's air defense, which is not ideal when there are pop-up threats and S-300s about. And even then, that's only if you have the Ordnance to drop. Russia's operational tempo and footage released suggests that after the high intensity of their operations in Syria against ISIS and NATO-backed rebels, that the underfunded and largely corrupt logistics chain for the Russian Air Force has been unable to substantially replenish the ordnance expended over the past half a decade of operations. And with a high-intensity conflict now underway, they have gone through bombs much faster than they originally accounted for. Combined with the global current microchip shortage and Russia essentially being cut off from foreign trade due to sanctions, getting the capital and the raw materials to replenish those stockpiles may not even be possible, at least not to a significant enough degree to meet operational demands. But one might ask, perhaps alternate guidance methods could be used for their ordnance. Precision targeting may be out of the question from assets in the field, but perhaps GPS-guided munitions could overcome some of these limitations. Well, they could, if A, the Russians had them in any significant quantity, and B, if their GPS system GLONASS was accurate enough to perform precision strikes with in the first place, which again, frontline evidence and operational realities demonstrate that it isn't. GLONASS currently has 24 satellites in its constellation to provide global coverage. This is compared to GPS, which has 77 in orbit. Accuracy of GLONASS at peak performance, so that's no electronic warfare interference, no jamming, no spoofing, no atmospheric distortion, no terrain variances, literally perfect conditions. Okay, so we're assuming that the Ukrainians, with the assistance of the United States, is not jamming, it's not blocking, it's not doing anything, this is completely peacetime conditions. Okay? The accuracy of this system in complete peacetime conditions is around 3 meters from a target. That is its best performance. To put that in perspective, GPS gets down to 30 centimeters. Which, for a high explosive or armor-piercing weapon deployed from an aircraft, factoring in wind and other factors, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to destroy an armored target. You'd have to have a very big bomb to destroy an armored target, and in less than ideal conditions, this variance can go much higher to the point where it renders the weapon completely ineffective. They can't hit anything. Combine that with the aforementioned inferiority of the data link and targeting systems used by Russian aircraft, the ability to employ their GLONASS-guided weapon systems effectively in a close air support environment is degraded to the point where it becomes unsafe and combat ineffective to use them. So, given that the Ukrainian IADS is intact, the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying sorties, including fighter intercepts, and their precision weapon systems are both low in number and of dubious performance, with the exception of terminally guided laser weapons from ground teams, frontline Russian CAS units have been forced to visually acquire targets manually, coming in low and fast to avoid being engaged by medium to long-range SAMs and manpads, just like their Ukrainian counterparts, and they've been flying these missions with unguided munitions, dumb bombs and rockets. The efficacy of these strikes against highly mobile and heavily camouflaged Ukrainian targets has been minimal as a result. And of course, when we've seen them deviate from this, coming in under the clouds at around 5,000-foot AGL and Su-34s in order to attempt precision strikes, they've either been forced away by Ukrainian SAMs or shot down by them. Which leads into Russia's seed and electronic warfare capability. In the opening phase of the invasion, we saw an extensive seed presence in support of the initial assault on Hostomel and Kyiv, which achieved local superiority over the airspace. And throughout the war, we have seen the Russians manage to achieve local air superiority when they deploy enough electronic warfare support in the area. Su-34s and Su-30s have been flying religiously with Kibini L-175 jamming pods in place to protect themselves from air intercept and ground-based targeting radars, while flying regularly with Kh-31P anti-radiation missiles for the purpose of suppressing Ukrainian pop-up SAM threats. But unlike the United States aviation branches, they do not have dedicated seed squadrons. They do not specifically train in it, nor do they fly these missions systematically as part of a coordinated effort to disrupt and destroy the enemy integrated air defense system as a whole. Nor do they have dedicated aircraft or targeting systems designed to perform the role. And the equipment they do have is configured primarily to target NATO systems, which they've had to modify in the field to counter their own equipment. And as is the case with the other systems they need, they simply don't have enough of it, limiting the number of sorties they can fly, the utility of those sorties, and rendering the Russians incapable of degrading Ukraine's air defense enough to allow for conventional air operations to resume over the battlefront. And these various system shortages, as well as their dubious efficacy, has had a detrimental effect on the number of operational sorties the Russian Air Force has been able to fly. Recent estimates have placed the Russians at 250 sorties on average, with an occasional increase to 400 sorties per day. And a solid half of those are combat air patrols as part of their integrated air defense network. To put that in perspective, during Operation Desert Storm, NATO flew 116,000 sorties over 6 weeks, averaging out to 2,760 sorties per day. Now, while Ukraine's IADS isn't as large or as powerful as Iraq's, when you consider that it took NATO 6 weeks to destroy Iraq's defenses with dedicated aircraft and squadrons trained for that very purpose, the Russians were never going to be able to achieve air superiority, no matter how hard they tried, unless they got organized and equipped for that purpose. Which, when one looks back at the low budget, the damage done by Russia's internal corruption, and the now huge financial and logistical stress of being cut off from the global market, they are most likely not going to be able to recoup and reorganize to the extent required to pursue it. And that, I think, is what all of this really comes down to. Their logistics and their budget. Again, looking at the average flight hours for a frontline Russian pilot, some estimates have it as low as 80 hours total a year, with some allowances for higher values among pilots deployed to Syria. That's less than 2 hours a week, which to maintain proficient in operational capability is nowhere near enough. US Air Force and US Navy pilots get close to double that, and that's on average. If they are on deployment or on active duty rotation, they can get much, much higher. And given the recent war on terror and the rising tensions in Asia, this happens in the United States military far more frequently, and that says nothing about simulator time. And this lack of funding bleeds over into every facet of their operation, maintenance especially. As we've seen regarding Ukraine's Air Force, Soviet jets, while easy to maintain, are nevertheless maintenance heavy, especially the engines, as Russian-built engines tend to need an overhaul far more regularly than those of comparable Western designs. But it's a problem across the board. Spare parts, flight services, avionics, sensors and weapon systems. The cost of running a world-class air force in a combat environment is brutal even for the superpowers, and the average $70 billion Russian defense budget, which by the way, that's for their whole military, just isn't enough for that. Especially when most of that budget went into maintaining the nuclear arsenal and vanity projects, such as their 10 hypersonic missiles and all 6 of their so-called 5th-generation fighters. You know, the ones with exposed rivets on their flight surfaces. And may I remind you, those are just the major overarching problems. If we go down to the ground-level minutiae, we will be here for another 4 hours. It's that chronic. In fact, if you recall back to the early stages of the war, things got so bad at one point as part of their organization, the Russians were running out of fuel at their air bases. Fuel is one of their number one exports. The lines were so clogged up, they weren't getting enough fuel to their aircraft. It's ridiculous. And so here we have it. The Air Force of a nuclear world power, with a shoestring budget, no training, outmoded technology, not fit for purpose, and lacking overall in all the areas it needed to excel in to accomplish the mission it was assigned. And the worst part is, we haven't even gone into how the Air Force fits in to the overall force structure. Communications and inter-service cooperation in the Russian forces have been absolutely abysmal. The only branch of air power that has been able to work successfully with the ground forces on anything like a regular basis is their attached helicopter units, and as we saw before, they've been forced out of the battle area due to the sheer number of manpads present. And needless to say, the same issues facing the Air Force also affects them, as they are way too hampered by data technology and a restricted budget. And that and their QRF bases are now, thanks to the fact that the front has stabilized, as well as some of their new toys, in range of Ukrainian artillery. Really, the only part of the operation that's worked is the air defense contingent, and even then, they failed multiple times in the earlier phase with the attack on Belgorod, the Bayraktars, not moving with the ground forces properly, not maintaining their air defense screen, falling asleep at the wheel, allowing the Ukrainians to sneak around and blow up their shit, and not wanting to diminish the efforts of the home team by any means. But if you can't defend your airspace from a bunch of clapped-out, hand-me-down MiGs from the early 80s with the gear you have, they should just hand their aircraft over to the North Koreans and let them have a go, because come on. So now what? Where does the air war go? Well, given they are out of options, the Russians have, for the most part, stopped flying sorties inside Ukrainian territory directly. They still fly missions against the front line itself, but they primarily only hit fixed targets they can map on their inertial navigation systems, like bunker complexes, towns, factories, headquarters, etc. Targets they can use standard dumbfire munitions against, rather than precision ordnance. As we established before, their equipment and the combat environment make their employment near impossible against battlefield targets unless they are willing to risk a lot of aircraft to do it. Other signs of changing priorities are that air operations in Syria have resumed, with some aircraft being transferred away from the Ukrainian AO. Now, Russian bots and trolls in the comments will say that they are no longer needed due to the crushing victory won by our brave boys in the Donbass. But I suspect the real reason is it's just too hazardous for them to carry out missions over Ukraine, and that as a result, the Russians have made an intelligent decision and moved assets to where they'll be more effective and of more use. Which leads me to my final point. Despite all the trashing I've given them, despite all the flaws and faults their corrupt hellscape of a country has, for better or for worse, the Russians are not stupid. Okay, they're not completely stupid. The simple fact is, they didn't expect this resistance level, nor have they experienced a conflict like this. The Soviet and later the Russian Air Force has never had to face an IADS. They've never revised their doctrine to match the changing conditions of modern war. After Desert Storm, analysts and officers in the Russian Air Force begged and pleaded their government to invest in the capabilities and doctrinal changes. There were people in their organization, like there are in every organization all over the world. Every time there's an institution, there's always a couple of people in there who are saying, please, we need to invest in the capabilities and the doctrinal changes. We need to change things. They needed to be able to wage a similar campaign, but the corruption, the Byzantine bureaucracy, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union laid wastes to all of their efforts, and now they are paying the price. But like the Russians somehow always manage to do, they are making the best of their situation after all other methods have been tried and failed. Russian air operations have switched almost entirely to a strategic bombing campaign aimed at the destruction of Ukraine's economy. At present, the Ukrainian economy is hemorrhaging due to the war. The best and the brightest of their workforce are either mobilized in the fight or refugees fleeing the violence. Production, trade, domestic investment is all completely in the toilet, with several of their major cities having been reduced to rubble or occupied by the invading force. The Russians know they can't hit targets with precision, nor can they conduct standard air operations, but they have a large number of cruise missiles, a strategic bomber capability that the Ukrainians can't counter, and reconnaissance satellites able to give them targeting data for factories, grain silos, oil tank farms, and other vital pieces of military and economic infrastructure. Every day, the 37th Air Army mounts a maximum effort to strike strategic targets, while the Russian ground forces utilize armor and artillery as their primary fire support assets at the front, and this has proven to be far more effective. Yet even here, though, the Russians are still falling short, as the Pentagon has estimated that 40% of Russian cruise missile strikes miss their intended targets, with tube and rocket artillery similarly suffering due to the limitations of their equipment. But hitting fixed strategic targets is a lot easier than hitting tactical targets. They don't move. And if there's one thing the Russians can do, it's accuracy by volume. If the Russians can maintain their operational tempo with a proper strategic cruise missile offensive, they may have a chance to force Ukraine to the negotiating table if they win a decisive victory on the ground somewhere. But as time goes by and the Ukrainians grow ever stronger, that hope seems to be fading fast. Russia is resorting to tactics, simply put, that the Allies used during World War II. They can't hit the specific building, they'll flatten the city, killing everyone around it. And with Russia's isolation from the global market, shrinking economy, and subsequent inability to import the various materials and technologies required to maintain production to replenish their forces and their capability, they may very well be forced to suspend strike operations altogether. It's a race against time for both sides now, and quite frankly, it's up to us. It's up to us here in the Western world. It's up to us here in Australia, Germany, France, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Spain, Greece. It's up to all of us around the world to decide who wins it. The Ukrainians have demonstrated the will. We just need to give them the way. We need to get the Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. They need aircraft. They need training. They need missiles. They need spare parts. They need crews. They need forces. They need our help. All that being said, hey Russia, how's your airbase in Crimea going? Slava Ukraine.